Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single podcast and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite subscription service. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Colonel Matthias Rogg, German Armed Forces historian, a former international fellow, and now instructor and professor at the U.S. Army War College here in Carlisle, and I'm your host today. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. This podcast deals with the relation of power, violence, and culture, and it is also about memory and identity. Both military and cultural professionals know little, in my perspective far too little, about the importance of cultural property protection in war. Today we want to go a little bit deeper, looking on cultural property protection from different sides in historical and international law, from a military and a cultural perspective. I have invited two internationally renowned specialists whom I will introduce later and with whom I would like to enter a conversation. Numerous references to publications, films, and websites are linked in the show notes. On the first hand, military and culture are in a state of tension. Some say they are in opposition. Probably every one of us has immediate images which comes to mind of how war threatens not only people but also their cultural values. Cultural properties are objects, places, areas for sure, but they are also more abstract heritages of significant cultural value. The destruction but also the seizure, misuse and humiliation of culture seems to be part of everyday life in war. We can go back to ancient history and beyond. Just think of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Roman army and the immense political and ideological importance of this place up to now. But these diverse points of contact can also be found in more recent history. Perhaps you know the film Monument Man, a pretty successful American-German production from 2014, with movie stars such as George Clooney, Bill Murray, and Cate Blanchett, great actors and, I think, good entertainment. But it's also about a piece of contemporary history. The film, based on Robert M. Eatzel's non-fictional book, The Monuments Men, Allied Heroes, Nazi, Seeth, and the Greatest Treasure Hunt in History. The book is about a group of American and British art and culture specialists, the so-called Monuments Men. They were tasked by the U.S. Army to save important works of art from destruction by the Nazis at the end of the Second World War. Both the book and the movie touch the topic on several levels. It is about the fragility of art and culture in war, and it is about misused art stolen in war, and it is also about the central question of whether it is worth using the military and the lives of soldiers to protect art and culture. To bring it to the point, it deals with the question, blood for stones? Some critics found the movie Monuments Men too pathetic. Some experts criticized its historical accuracy, but the film met with great public interest. For the first time, a popular film production had drawn attention to a topic that international experts had been dealing with for a long time. For example, Tim Slade's stunning 2016 produced documentary, The Destruction of Memory, based on the same-name book written by Robert Bevan. The destruction of culture in war, it doesn't matter if it's architecture or something else of value, is almost always not so-called collateral damage. Rather, it is a matter of willful destruction. The target is not only the architecture itself. It is the inherent historical value and cultural message, and finally, the identity of societies. The latter is the real target. In a nutshell, the misappropriation, the manipulation, and finally the destruction of cultural property is a matter of fact in crisis, conflicts, and war. It can trigger destabilization, it can bolster violence, it is part of information campaigning, and we find it in a range of all gray zones of hybrid conflict up to the brute use of military force. The British journalist and best-selling author Charlie English wrote a fascinating book about the threat and destruction, but also the rescue of cultural assets during war, which was published in 2015. I can strongly recommend the book Smugglers of Timbuktu. It's about the unique culture of the ancient 500-year-old library and architecture of Timbuktu, a desert city in the West African state Mali. Due to its significance, it was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1998, and thus considered just as important as the Egypt pyramids of Giza or the Statue of Liberty in New York. It was this World Heritage Site of Timbuktu that was conquered by Islamist militias during the civil war in 2012 in Mali. Charlie English describes how most of the precious books could be saved at the risk of life of some librarians. But the World Heritage architecture, 12 mosques and mausoleums in Timbuktu, had to suffer severe threats. At least the perpetrators were caught. Their leader, Ahmed al-Faqi, subsequently had to answer for cultural terrorism at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. The verdict was handed down in 2015, and it was a sensation for many. For the first time in the history of international law, someone was found guilty and sentenced in case of a crime against cultural property. So now I would like to talk to my first guest about this and about the importance of international law in protecting cultural property in crisis and conflicts. I heartily welcome Professor Dr. Lando Kirchmair, a colleague who teaches at the German University of the Bundeswehr in Munich, my sister university. He studied law, business law, Spanish and Portuguese, and psychology at the universities of Innsbruck, Salamanca, and Salzburg. His research focuses on international law, the relationship of legal systems and cultural heritage. Here he has published a number of splendid articles and books. You will find some in the show notes. Since April 2020, he is Deputy Professor for National and International Public Law with a focus on the protection of cultural heritage at the Department of Social Science and Public Affairs at the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich. So Lando, a warm welcome to our podcast.
Well, thank you, Matthias. It's great that I can be your guest, and thanks for having me. Looking forward to our discussion.
Great, Lando. So I just mentioned that the indictment and conviction of the destruction of cultural property in Timbuktu was a milestone in international law. Do you agree? And what were or what are the consequences for international law?
Well, yes, Matthias, like the conviction of Al-Mahdi for the destruction of cultural property in Timbuktu, I think it is fair to say that this was a milestone in the protection of cultural heritage under international law. The case set the precedent at the International Criminal Court for holding individuals accountable for the willful destruction of cultural heritage sites. And the implications for international law are manifold. Just let me highlight some of them. Like the case highlighted the importance of preserving cultural heritage. It reinforced the notion that cultural heritage is not only valuable to a particular community or a specific group, but it is part of the common heritage of mankind and deserves protection under international law precisely for that. Another important aspect, the prosecution and conviction demonstrated that international criminal law, as practiced at the ICC, can be effective in holding individuals accountable for crimes against cultural heritage. And as a corollary, a clear message has been sent. Perpetrators of cultural heritage destruction can be held accountable for their actions. This can serve as a deterrent against future crimes against cultural heritage sites, and thus many hope help protect such sites from further destruction during armed conflicts.
So the destruction of cultural property in wars I just mentioned is nothing new. On the contrary, in your opinion, why did it take so long for the issue to come before the International Criminal Court?
Well, that's right. It's nothing new. The history is full of destruction of cultural property during wars. But I'm an optimist. And as an optimist, I would put an emphasis on the fact that there is also a history of protecting cultural heritage through international criminal law. Consider, for example, the trial of Alfred Rosenberg at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, or the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY. In both cases, specific crimes related to cultural heritage, particularly cultural property, were included in the jurisdiction of both tribunals. Another aspect is that international law, including the protection of cultural heritage during armed conflict, it has evolved over time. It took decades for the international community to establish comprehensive legal frameworks such as the 1954 Hague Convention and its protocols that specifically address the protection of cultural property during armed conflict. The ICC, on the other hand, to be fair with this institution, is a relatively recent development in international law. The Rome Statute, its founding treaty, entered into force only in 2002. And jurisdictional challenges, one has to add, are also an issue. Prosecuting crimes against cultural heritage can be difficult, especially when the destruction occurs in regions or countries where the ICC's jurisdiction is limited.
So a lot has been done in the last years, but once again, do you think more legal remedies in international law are sufficient to protect cultural property? Do you see a need for development or change?
Well, that's a difficult question. I'd say there's always room for improvement, even though I'm an optimist. But one of the most important issues today would be to strengthen the enforcement mechanisms, I think. There are international conventions, there are treaties which protect cultural heritage, also during armed conflict. But enforcement mechanisms, one has to say, can sometimes be weak or even inadequate. So greater efforts may be needed to ensure that states comply with their obligations under these conventions and that perpetrators of cultural heritage destruction are held accountable. Another aspect is threats other than armed conflict. One example is climate change. So we seem somehow ill-equipped to deal with climate change in general. This also affects cultural heritage. And less to do with improving international law itself. I think we should aim at improving international cooperation and raising awareness of the importance of cultural heritage. Protecting cultural heritage often requires international cooperation and coordination among states, international organizations, cultural heritage experts, other stakeholders, and strengthening mechanisms for sharing information, expertise, and resources could improve the effectiveness of cultural heritage protections on a global scale.
So, from your perspective as a professor for international public law, how should military and civilian agencies work together to protect cultural property in crises and wars? Where do you see room for, let me say, for development and improvement?
This is interesting. And before answering your question, I would like to emphasize something first. It seems to me that it is still underestimated that cultural heritage is actually also a security issue. So we have seen that looting of cultural heritage and its illegal sale has contributed to financing terrorism. This is a security issue too. Another security issue is that cultural heritage is of immense importance to local communities because, among other things, identities are strongly intertwined with cultural heritage. Therefore, ignoring or downplaying cultural heritage, even in situations where military necessity does not dictate prioritizing other aspects, has been shown to have a negative impact on the reputation of military operations and how local communities perceive foreign military presence on their territory is, I would argue, also a security issue. So, having said that, I think there's several ways to improve cooperation and coordination between military and civilian agencies. I would just put the emphasis on one or two aspects. One aspect is training and education. Both is key. You need to be aware of cultural heritage and its importance in order to protect it. Simple as that. And both military and civilian agencies involved in crisis response and conflict situations should receive training and education on the importance of cultural heritage, its protection, relevant legal frameworks, and also best practices. So, a very simple example, I think practical exercises and even simulations could enhance preparedness and response capabilities. There are many more things, but just one aspect which I think is quite interesting for the German armed forces is the need to engage with local communities. Military and civilian authorities should engage with local communities and cultural stakeholders to better understand their needs, concerns, and priorities regarding the protection of cultural property. An example of this in the German armed forces are so-called intercultural advisors, die interkulturelle Einsatzberatung. Just very shortly, these intercultural advisors, they aim to gather local knowledge, form a network, build expertise, which can inform then decision-making processes and help identify culturally sensitive approaches, which in large can help to protect cultural heritage.
So there are a lot of layers and connecting points between law and the military. And finally, I would like to ask you something very personal. But of course, it is also a question for the lawyer. Where do you see ethical boundaries in the protection of cultural property in war? Is it justified and appropriate to risk the life of soldiers in order to protect cultural property? What do you think?
Well, it's a really hard question. It's tough to answer it if you put the question as you did. So I think it's very difficult to deny that ethical dilemmas can arise in armed conflicts in general. The notion of military necessity, for instance, which may or may not override the protection of cultural heritage, is a constant point of debate. I teach this to my students. It is throughout history that what military necessity can override or cannot override is a matter of fierce debate. And there are situations for sure where someone has to make a choice. But I would like to emphasize, and I'm sorry for that, again, I'm an optimist, that these are very exceptional situations. So often it's not the case that you have to choose between stones and people, as some people put it. It is often possible to protect both cultural heritage and people. And in the long run, cultural heritage and the essence of being human are so strongly intertwined that it is hardly possible to separate them. So with a good preparation and looking into the future, in somehow planning operations, etc., I think it is possible to minimize these dilemma situations to a very small percentage. And as I said earlier, the protection of cultural heritage is also a security issue. So I think it is better to think those things together instead of making up dichotomies which are only relevant for very exceptional situations.
So thank you so much, Lando, for your insights from the perspective of a lawyer. And it was a great time and wonderful that you joined us in that podcast. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Matthias, for having me. As I said before, it's great that you devote time to this very important topic. And I would be happy if some of your listeners are just like curious now what the law can do to protect cultural heritage and how this can help enhance international cooperation.
Culture has always been at risk in wars, but it seems that the issue has taken on new importance since the end of the Cold War. Just to name a few examples. In the Yugoslav wars between 1991 and 2004, more than 6,000 important cultural buildings were destroyed, mainly churches and mosques, but also museums and archives. Or in Afghanistan, the Taliban destroyed the huge Buddha statues of Bamiyan in 1998 and 2001, which had been declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Or during the conquest of Baghdad in 2003, the US military stood idly by and watched as the Iraqi National Museum was looted. In March 2015, the Idlib Museum in Syria was looted by Syrian and government-supported forces. About 10,000 objects of invaluable cultural heritage were stolen. Also in 2015, the ancient oasis city of Palmyra in Syria, also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was conquered by the Islamic State. Before the terrorists blew up the unique buildings, they staged gruesome executions in front of the ancient backdrops. More than this, they posted videos of their atrocities in the internet with English commentaries and subtitles to let the world know what they did. As different as these examples are, we see similarities and patterns. First, the deliberate destruction of cultural property is about much more than material damage. It is almost always about the question, who has the power about memory, self-images, and thus identity? One could say violence against culture is increased violence against people. Without common cultural icons, post-bellum reconciliation work and state reconstruction are hardly possible. Second, culture is also threatened in wars if its importance is not recognized by the warring parties. This is exemplified by the looting of the Iraqi National Museum in Baghdad in 2003, or the ignorance of US soldiers when they built up camps and supply areas in ancient archaeological sites in Iraq and Afghanistan, resulting in dramatic destructions. Third, destroyed cultural assets are often lost for all times. Bridges can be rebuilt, houses can be repaired, but a destroyed historic church, a museum with its works of art, an archive with its documents, or library with its books cannot simply be restored. What was destroyed in war is often irretrievably lost. Fourth, especially in the globalized world, the deliberate destruction of culture is not a single national matter. Culture does not belong to an ethnic group, a nation, or an elite. It belongs to the general public and thus to humanity. And finally, fifth, in crises and conflicts, the struggle of cultural icons in space, in Germany we call it Raumzeichen, can be read like a seismograph. The targeted destruction of cultural property in war is always an early warning of massive violations of human rights. In other words, if cultural property is deliberately destroyed, then all other taboos fall away. Therefore, religious buildings such as churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, cemeteries, and other holy sites are particularly at risk in crises and conflicts, especially if they are culturally significant. The protection of cultural property is therefore a complex issue. It has a legal, ethical, and a political dimension, and it affects military action and military decisions at all tactical, operational, and strategic levels. But nevertheless, the topic seems only to be slowly being accepted by the armed forces. The organizational structures and contact persons are very different in all countries, and therefore the structures are difficult to understand. In Italy, the Carabinieri have their own department dedicated to the cultural protection since the 1960s, the so-called Carabinieri Tutela Patrimonio Culturali Command, under the direction of a general. The Austrian army has had officers for the protection of cultural property for decades. Here, the cultural property protection is also integrated into training and operational situations. In France and Germany, there is still great reluctance to integrate the topic into military operational planning. Experts who could advise cultural property protection officers are a long way off there. With the Nordic Center of Cultural Heritage and Armed Conflict in Copenhagen, founded in 2017, the Northern European states at least have an independent international organization that supports governments, military organizations, and also cultural institutions in cultural property protection in armed conflicts. The Nordic Center has produced a number of important studies with concrete recommendations for action, not least with regard to NATO. The multinational NATO-accredited Civil Military Cooperation Center of Excellence, the CCOE, in The Hague in the Netherlands, has also tackled the issue. And NATO has developed some basic documents, especially since 2019. After all, the Western Military Alliance itself hosted an international conference on cultural property protection on the NATO headquarters in Brussels in February 2023. Thanks to all of you for listening. Please send us your comments and suggestions for this and future episodes. Please subscribe to A Better Peace on your podcatcher of choice. And once you have, please rate and review this podcast, because that's how more people can hear about us, so that we can continue to grow this community for conversations like this one. This conversation is over, but we look forward to welcoming you again. Until next time, from the War Room, I'm Matthias Rogg.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.